Okay, and then just check to confirm we are in fact live. Perfect. We got video and audio. Hello, YouTube. Let's start with this beautiful intro we have. Assuming the media panel will go live. Sometimes Riverside's a little finicky. Okay, perfect. Welcome to Go Time, everybody.
Let's do it. It's go time.
Hello, 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 wonderful Gophers. We're back for another episode, and on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about HTML templating and a nice little project called Templ. Joining me today is my wonderful co-host, John. How are you doing today, John?
I am doing well. How are you doing, Kris?
Doing well. A little overcast, but besides that, hopefully it's not going to rain, hopefully. And joining us as well is the founder of Templ, Adrian Hesketh. How are you doing today, Adrian?
Doing grand, thank you.
Excellent. And for those of you who don't know, Adrian has around 20 years of experience. He's worked on Perl, ASP, Visual Basic, C#, a whole bunch of other stuff, Go, JavaScript, TypeScript. Very, very long list here. He works as a tech lead and architect for customers. And he recently worked on a vehicle insurance platform with our other guest, Joe, where they picked Go and event-driven architecture with serverless for the project. Sold the first policy 6 months later. Oh, that's a nice accomplishment there. And the project created 30 new Go jobs and nearly 30 new Go programmers. That's exciting. That's quite the accomplishment there.
Yeah, it was a really interesting project, pretty intense at times, and it's still really successful now. There's a whole team continuing to develop that, and selling lots of car insurance in the UK.
That's awesome. And using Go to do it. It's quite fantastic. Yeah. And joining us as well is Joe Davidson, who is a maintainer on the Templ project. And Joe has worked with Go for 3 years now, mainly in the world of distributed systems, a place I love and is near and dear to my heart, using AWS and serverless tech. How are you doing today, Joe?
Yeah, I'm good there. Bit warm in the UK though.
It's been a bit warm all over the place. Like I was hoping to get to fall temperatures, and here on the East Coast it was like 90 this week, or in the mid 90s.
Say it was pretty warm last weekend. The rain was I was actually kind of liking the rain because it was cooling things off, and Kris is like, hopefully it doesn't rain.
True. I've been hiding in my air-conditioned apartment for the past week, so I haven't experienced outside very much. So to me, it's just like, oh, it's just pretty out there, but it's like 90 something or whatever. Like I don't even know what. It's like, yeah, it is literally 90 degrees outside. It probably should rain.
Yeah, I guess we're being quiet because we have no idea what 90 degrees is.
Boiling temperature.
Right.
That sounds really bad.
It's 32.2 Celsius is what it's.
Oh, that's really hot.
Yes. It's quite warm.
We're struggling, and it's like 25.
Do you guys struggle with
degrees.
the fact that like? Do you guys struggle with the fact that like 1 degree of Celsius is like a pretty, not a crazy broad range, but it's like a broader range than Fahrenheit?
No, I wouldn't say so. I guess I like the fact 0 is ice, 100 is steam. Like,
I like that. I want a little bit more like precision, I guess, in between sometimes.
It's the UK. It's always either raining, windy. You can really never tell what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's not like those places in North America where it goes from like -20 in the winter all the way up to like 105 in the summer, and you need that expressive range.
It's also only like 2 degrees, I think. It's not like a huge range, so it's not that outrageous. It's just I feel like it would matter more for like cooking or something along those lines than it would for just your outside temperature. But then at the same time, I've also learned as I cook more that you don't have to be that precise with a lot of things when you're doing that. At
No,
least
that's
for
true.
my level of cooking.
Yeah. Precision is I don't know. It's just what you're used to. It's kind of like the default OS you get loaded up with. It's just kind of like everything makes sense from that reference point.
To be fair, the UK has got no leg to stand on here, have we? We're using pints for drinks. We've got like liters to fill the car, but then everything's in miles per hour and gallons per miles per gallon and all that. So we just complete absolute mess.
Oh, so it's like Canada in that where you like use different units depending on the thing that you're talking. That's so confusing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are not here today to talk about different ways to measure how hot or cold it is outside. We're actually here today to talk about templating, and specifically HTML templating with Go. And so let's just start off with, there's an HTML templating library built into the standard library. I literally believe it's called HTML/template. And you, Adrian, have built a new one. So can you give us kind of the background on that? Like why build a new templating library for Go?
Great question. Well, I've been building web apps for a long time, around 20 years. And so I've been through a variety of different technologies through that, from like ASP 3.0 back in the day, where you don't really have anything. You're just writing kind of text to the output stream and no escaping or anything like that. You've got to do all that yourself. And, through to kind of modern stuff like JSX, where you've got this sort of super expressive language, this ability to build components and so on. And, I was picking up Go and sort of looking to build out web pages and going, well, what would happen if I use Go instead of going for something like TypeScript for the front end? Instead of having this front end back end split of two different languages, could I maybe make it so it's just one language? Could I put the same amount of effort into sort of making the back end fast as I do in the JavaScript, and would that make a difference? And I just found the templating experience in Go pretty frustrating. Like there's a couple of like rough edges on it. So for instance, if you want to call a function, you've got to add it to a function map and remember the name that you're giving it in the function map. There's a sort of different syntax of how you do for loops. You can't just write arbitrary Go code inside the middle of your template. You have to sort of think about it in advance. And some of the errors happen at runtime, not compilation time. So I found it overall just not a great experience. And then to add to that, there isn't really any auto completion or anything like that. So if you want to sort of display a lot of information, like perhaps you're displaying, I don't know, an insurance policy to a customer, you might want to show all the different fields that are on there. And then if you just type that field incorrectly, you just end up with nothing on the screen, right? You don't end up, and you only find that out when you run the template. So I was thinking like, well, there's alternatives, right? So I tried out like lots of the different alternatives, and I realized none of them had kind of autocomplete at all. So I set about trying to sort of add auto-completion to existing tools that were out there. And I think the one that I liked the most was probably Quick Template. So initially the project started out as, could I add LSP type features like auto-completion, go to definition and all that stuff on top of an existing project? And it turned out that due to the kind of internals of how it worked, that was impossible. So I was like, okay, right, it's on. Let's have a go.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that seems like I like that approach there, thinking of it as like, I'd like to have some autocomplete for my templates, because I've definitely written a lot of large, gnarly templates, and it is exhausting trying to hunt down, like, why is this one thing incorrect? Or where is this one thing I'm missing? Or it's like, oh, you just mistyped this, or oh, you mistyped it when you put it into the function map, or all of that. So I definitely have felt those pains before.
Yeah, that's right. I think if you're going to try and tell people, hey, there's this alternative to what you're doing over here that you could use instead, but it's actually like lots worse. It's lots worse in these ways. I think it's a really hard kind of thing to swallow for people. They're just going to be like, well, I'm going to use this thing that I've got over here. So I thought I'd try and deal with that kind of early on. Okay.
And how old is this project? When were you thinking about doing this?
It's probably like 3 years ago. I started thinking about, I've run a lot of JavaScript front-end projects, and I saw how much people were struggling with learning React. And because it's not like you learn React, right? React is kind of relatively straightforward on its own, but a lot of developers are also learning TypeScript, and perhaps they're learning then the JavaScript ecosystem that goes along with it. And so, and even if you've been doing JavaScript a long time, the JavaScript I learned in 1998 is very, very different to the JavaScript that people are writing today. So people are trying to sort of learn TypeScript and all that kind of stuff. And they're bringing their own knowledge to it. So, C# people write it like they're writing C# with loads of types everywhere. And other people write it as JavaScript with a few type annotations. And I just found that people really struggled to learn TypeScript and adopt it. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there's a simpler way that we can build web apps. And I saw things like DHH putting together Hotwire, the turbo kind of thing with the hey.com and HTMX and those kinds of new kind of old-fashioned ways of looking at the front end. So they reminded me of things like the ASP.NET update panel from years ago. And I thought, oh, right, okay, I wonder if, could that work in the modern world? And so I kind of approached it from that point of view of making something that was really suitable for building those kinds of apps.
Nice. All right. So once you decided that you wanted to build this thing, what was the process you went through to actually create it and bring it to existence? Was it just like, I make a GitHub repo and then start writing code? Was there some more planning that went into it?
Well, yes, I guess, I can't remember how I actually started the project. I'm going to have to look back at the first commit and see what that actually looked like. But I'd already worked on a parser library. So, and I'd already written a HTML parser in the past in a different programming language. Because I used to work in the language translation industry. So I had this experience of parsing in HTML. Actually, my job was to try and parse invalid HTML and XML, get the text out of it, and then put it back in its completely broken form as it was without messing anything up. So I did a lot of work around parsing broken HTML and XML. So I knew I could write it. So I started out with the kind of parser elements of it. And initially, really, I was aiming at building a cut down version of Quick Template. So like the syntax in like the first version was basically a ripoff of Quick Template with the objective of trying to put the LSP functionality in and do a proof of concept around, could I add the LSP functionality to Quick Template? So when I realized that Quick Template doesn't really have an internal object model, so it doesn't pass the template into a sort of in-memory representation, which then allows you to sort of interact with it. It's very sort of the generator just kind of, as it's working through, just spits out Go code as it goes. So there's no sort of intermediary step that would make it possible to build a language server that could kind of look at what was going on. So I realized I would have to make a parser for it again. So I started out for building the parser and then as a cut down version of the project. So I got that out pretty quickly. And then I had to learn how to build language servers because I actually didn't know. I'd never tried it before. And so that was the second part was, okay, how would you go around building a language server?
Cool.
So when you were going through this process, you said that you had like quick templates to work from. I assume that means that you didn't really have to sit down and like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is my process for something like this would be to actually sit down and be like, what do I want a template to look like? So I'd actually write some HTML with some, Go code or whatever inside of it. And I'd write a couple of those a few times to sort of feel like, what do I like want this to be, ignoring like how hard it is to implement or anything, just what would I want it to be ideally? Did you already have that then from the quick template stuff, or did you end up changing a little bit from what they had?
So Quick Template had a lot of options. So things like how you could format things to strings and so on like that. And so in my mind, what I wanted was something that was, maximally as close to Go as possible. So very much like JSX or there used to be this thing called Razor Views in C#, where you're just writing your code straight inside the template. And so you've got this ability, you don't even need to learn anything. You can just look at it and how it works, right? Because it's just like your programming language, but with that in. But I was really looking for like the maximum adoption and sort of, I didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel if I didn't need to. So it's really like, okay, well, Quick Template is really popular. Let's try and add it to that. Let's contribute to the community rather than trying to sort of build my own thing, right? So, but I didn't really get any engagement from that. And there were some limitations in, I thought the design of Quick Template would make it really hard to do some of the LSP features. So I switched out and in the end sort of made a version 2 that was like, okay, actually, this is the direction that I think we should go in. And that's the one that you see today with, which is really, the inversion was like, instead of it being HTML with Go inside it, it was Go with HTML inside it. So it's like really pure kind of drive forward.
Yeah, that's where we kind of had some of the real conversation.
Yeah.
What's
Actually,
ergonomic? What can make this language
it's possible
to write in Go, rather than like handlebars type, having curly braces and then percentage signs and equal signs everywhere. You just kind of want it to be as Go-y as possible.
And by that point, we had real users, right? Ourselves and our team. So we were using an early version of Templ to build HTML for PDFs that produced insurance documents. So we had real users of it, and they were telling us things like, "Hey, I really don't like having to type 2 characters because like the initial version was a curly brace and then a percentage symbol and then another percentage symbol and a curly brace to close it off." And they were like, "This isn't great, right? Because it's too much typing." And I could totally, and that was kind of the syntax we inherited from Quick Template. So we started to sort of go, okay, well, what would a second version look like? And we did exactly what you were thinking there of like, what should it look like? So you'll see that a template looks like a function because, that's what it is. It's a function that returns a component. So we tried to make it sort of the most obvious thing you could think of.
I think it's interesting there because like Plush is the other template library I can think of that was written for Go. And they kind of took the opposite approach of let's take something, instead of something new but feels like Go, it was let's take something that people are familiar with from another programming language and try to do that. And I think both approaches work. It's just a matter of like what you're trying to support and sort of what your goals are. Because I've looked at both and I feel like I could be happy using either of them. It's just a matter of like what I'm trying to do. I will say that I was shocked when I saw like that there was an LSP, especially as early as there was for Templ, because usually that's something that like something has to get pretty big before they even consider doing it. But when you mentioned that was something on like at the front of your mind when you're like figuring out how to design it and build it, that makes a whole lot more sense that you were building for an LSP from the start versus, oh, it's an afterthought and now it's really hard to get working because it was an afterthought.
Oh yeah, it was much easier to get working because it was considered from the beginning. And I think the strategy that we picked with Templ also made it fairly straightforward to build the LSP, because the way that Templ like creates compiled templates from Go, so it generates Go code from the template that you put in. So you write the template out in your text editor, you run the Templ generate command, and it generates a Go code, and that's what makes it really, really fast. But the other thing is, as it's generating the Go code, it knows which bits are the Go expressions inside the braces and which bits are the HTML outside it that it's generating itself. And so the LSP can piggyback on top of Go Please, the Go language server, and provide all the features that Go Please provides by just remapping the source code locations between the generated output and the template file that's in there. So essentially, that's our cheat code for getting an LSP in from the get-go.
So when you say you're generating Go code, I'm assuming I haven't actually looked at the source code. I'm assuming you're not generating something that uses the HTML template package. You're using your own.
No.
Okay.
That would have been actually pretty good, yeah.
I mean, I assume it'd be possible, but I also feel like that might limit what you could do at some point.
It really would.
If it doesn't support something really well and you wanted to do it.
Yeah. It generates really bog standard Go code. All the Go code implements the same interface. It produces it takes parameter, like each function or template takes parameters, and then it returns a component which has a function on it called render, and you can render that out to any output stream. So like the standard or a file or a response.
So you guys built your own parser to make sure that there's not like code injection, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We took the features from Google's Safe HTML project and sort of looked at how they'd approached it and how Hugo had approached it, because I think early versions of Hugo had some issues around sort of injection, and so I think from the get-go, everything was things like HTML encoded and HTML attribute encoded, so it's context aware of that. But sort of early feedback from version 1 from the kind of wider Go community was, hey, what's the security model of the rest of it? So what happens if you start to use script tags, and what if you're injecting CSS attributes and some of the other elements of that? So I went back around and rethought how that could work, and added 2 new capabilities. One was this thing called a CSS template. So this idea that you can bundle, like if you've used CSS in JavaScript type techniques, then you generally want to have your like component, like a label or a button, include all of the CSS that's relevant to that button. And then you can use like an optimization that means that CSS is only rendered once to the page, even if there's multiple copies of the same component. And so Templ can do that. You can create a CSS template, and then it's only rendered as CSS once on that single page. But also you can pass in dynamic CSS attributes, and those are properly escaped using there's essentially snippets from the Google Safe HTML library, which covers all that kind of context escaping. And then the same applies to scripting. So like if you have some script that you want to attach to a particular component, sort of maybe like a reusable form element or some other element, you can pass parameters to it dynamically, but it knows that those things are dynamic and therefore can't be trusted, and JSON escapes them to look out for those kinds of issues like that. Like I say, my plan is to be able to use this stuff for real production, like real production workloads. In my place of work. That's the goal.
Yeah.
And like I say, we use it at the moment for generation of PDF documents, somewhere in the region of a few thousand a day for customers.
So when you were setting this up, did you ever like worry that the second generate step was going to like cause pushback or cause people to like be scared away from the process? I guess especially knowing that, if I recall correctly, you have LSP for like VS Code and a couple other editors, but I don't think Goland is there yet.
No, Goland only added support for LSP type plugins last month, believe it or not. So before that, it was a relatively bewildering set of steps. So there's only 2 of us that kind of are the core maintainers of the project. So I kind of stuck to what I know. I use Vim mostly day to day, NeoVim, and I also use VS Code typically when I'm demoing to people, and it's sort of less intimidating, or if I'm pair programming with somebody, right? So I stuck to the editors that I kind of know and can work with. And I just never really got into sort of JetBrains ID, even though I'm an old C# guy from back in the day. Still never really got into it. But yeah, last month they released the capability to do that, and the source code and stuff looks really straightforward to do. So it's definitely on the roadmap to do that.
Yeah,
I think there's
I guess
an
my
issue
question
in flight
is,
for it, isn't there?
Yeah. So my question, I guess, at that point is, did you worry that was going to like prevent adoption essentially? Like, because if you have a team that's using it, and some of those developers are using Goland, all of a sudden they're at a disadvantage compared to everybody else, which is a little bit unfortunate. Yeah,
that is unfortunate. And actually, yeah, it is a mixed team where there are some where all 3 of those editors are in play. But I think actually most of the teams that we work in, I think, Joe, you'd say the same, right? Like the editor, we kind of switch between editors a lot. So I think people really like the code with me feature in the JetBrains stuff, and they see like that seems to work. If you if you have a dodgy network connection from time to time, it seems to be a little bit more resilient to that than VS Code. So I think we find ourselves using like quite a few different editors. Like we practice a lot of mob programming at work. So there's generally like sometimes we'll all be on the same machine, or sometimes we'll be taking turns or different things. So it's in practice it turned out not to be a problem, but it's definitely something we want to sort out, because I think every year there's a Go what is it, like a questionnaire with like a summary of what people are doing. I think I think it's always like VS Code is one of the biggest, and then it's Goland, and then it's like Vim. But I think Vim has a surprising, is it like 20% usage? It's quite high.
Yeah, Vim is definitely the third, and it's quite high compared to other languages, which is always a little interesting. It's higher than like Emacs as well. Emacs is very low in those surveys usually, which I always find interesting.
So when you were doing the LSP with like VS Code, and I don't want to go too far in the LSP, but like, was it the same LSP for Vim and VS Code, or did you have to do anything custom for the 2?
Well, Joe maintains the sort of NeoVim plugin, if you like, but the LSP itself is identical. between all of the different things. But what you do have to add on is the syntax highlighting, which is sadly distinct for each kind of editor. So I maintain the VS Code plugin, and that uses, although Joe did a PR on it the other day, so we both do now. But it uses a different type of syntax highlighting structure than I think Golang does, and I think NeoVim uses a different one again. So that's probably the most irritating thing. So I think, Microsoft, if they're listening out there, it'd be ideal if you could, in the LSP, like write back the syntax highlighting rules, like, directly onto, highlight this and this, because then I could use the existing parser that we've already got instead of trying to recreate the parser in regular expressions just to do the syntax highlighting bit.
I was very excited to see tree sitter support for NeoVim, because that's been one of my favorite things about. I rebuilt my NeoVim setup a few months ago, and adding tree sitter and all of the powerful syntax highlighting and all of that it gives you, and also all of the nice little errors it gets you, are super nice.
Yeah, it is really good. That wasn't even a Good Samaritan. I can't remember their username. Contributed that, but yeah, was very happy. It's my had a few issues, like the highlighting would break down in certain places. First Vim plugin, so
yeah, I feel like that's something that's anybody who decides to build a project like this, I feel like they're likely going to be in the same spot, because I don't know anybody who's like an LSP specialist. At least I don't. That seems like a weird thing to specialize in, I guess.
Yeah, they must exist somewhere, like probably inside JetBrains or somewhere.
Yeah, or maybe like Microsoft has one that like went and actually helped build LSPs for all the different languages, but it's got to be a pretty small subset of developers who have that much experience.
The
I was asking a lot of those questions because I was asking those questions because I feel like other people building similar projects are going to be interested in how do I go about doing this stuff? Because I think you're right, like the three big ones of Goland, VS Code, and Vim. If you can support those, you've got a large enough group of Go developers that you're pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, well, I did a talk about LSPs and how to implement them at GopherCon UK last a couple of weeks back. So that's going to be hitting YouTube whenever they get around to editing it. And I did it just for that reason, just because, I've been through sort of the pain, if you like, of trying to interpret the specification, learn how it works, and kind of read other bits and pieces of source code and so on. So I've kind of gone through that, and I'm trying to share my experience of how other people can adopt it for these techniques for their projects, and hopefully help other people maintain them. Because I use things like the Nix language, which only recently got an LSP. And I think there's some other folks who are trying to build language servers for all sorts of different tools. So yeah, it's really, I think it's actually easier than it looks once you understand the spec. But the spec is quite difficult to get. There's no kind of entry point on the spec. It's just kind of starts hitting you with there's this type, there's this type, there's this type, there's these concepts, and then sort of initialization steps. And it's only, you have to kind of read a lot before you go, oh, okay. That's how it all fits together.
So when you were building this, did anybody ever tell you, or criticize you for building something that does server-side rendering when, because I feel like I hear this a lot where people are like, why are you building applications or showing something that uses server-side rendering when everything modern uses React, at least in their head. And this is especially true of, so I teach people how to do web development and other stuff. Mm-hmm. And I very much like to split it up to be okay, we're going to start with server side because it's significantly easier to wrap your head around. And then later we can add in the React stuff if you want. But there's no reason to start with something more complicated than necessary.
Yeah,
and I feel like you would have had that a ton because you're building a whole library around that.
Oh, absolutely. And but in the UK, we have this government agency called GDS, or Government Digital Services. And they've defined a set of standards for building government services, so things like renewing your passport, getting a shotgun license, or anything along those kinds of lines. And what they've really focused in on is the accessibility of those services. How can you make those services super easy to use? So things like the NHS, which is our National Health Service. If you want to log in to the NHS, apps to book a GP appointment or kind of look at your prescriptions and stuff. All those services follow the GDS kind of standards for logging in, and they almost work without JavaScript on the client, right? Because it's all about making sure that, if like a lot of people who are accessing healthcare systems and so on might have temporary problems with their eyesight or temporary problems. They haven't necessarily learned to adapt to using technology. So the idea is to make it sort of super straightforward. And so you see a lot of server-side rendering in those kinds of approaches, because it's kind of like the way that screen readers can work really effectively. It doesn't do any screen flashing, all the kinds of accessibility elements. I'm sure it's possible to do sort of really great stuff with JavaScript, but yeah, it's often it's set by clients to say no, absolutely no JavaScript. It must work without JavaScript. So it's not as uncommon. It's not as it's not completely out there to sort of make an app without JavaScript, even in 2023 in the UK at least. And then the other element is, like, I really do think it's difficult for people like to adopt these technologies and learn them effectively. We trained a lot of new engineers in TypeScript, and it is difficult for them to understand. Suddenly you're saying they're looking at the syntax and you're going, oh yeah, that's a union type, and oh, that's a nullish coalescence operator, and oh yeah, that's a function passed into a function. There's so much kind of syntax to unpack. It is difficult. So what I was thinking is, what if we focused on the rendering speed and on the server side, and use modern technique, like, use some of the new features we've got in browsers like WebSockets and server-sent events and all this other good stuff. Would it actually be any worse? Like, because I've been looking at Lighthouse scores, which measuring like page load speeds of SPA type apps, and you're talking seconds for pages to render, and I'm going, well, that doesn't seem right to me. Like, actually, you can do it faster if you adopt the server-side rendering.
And I should be clear, I wasn't trying to say you shouldn't do server-side, because I will definitely die on that hill of server-side is not dead. It's still very useful in a ton of things.
Yeah.
It's just, I was just curious if that's something you got a lot of criticism of, because there's always, I think it's especially common with new developers who nobody wants to write about server-side rendering because it's a technology that's so old that there's not really anything new to say about it. But React and all these things are so new, and sometimes it feels like they're reinventing the wheel in some things, so they get to write about it again.
That's true.
And as a result, you see all these posts about it. So it's like, oh, that's what I should be doing.
I think that's true. Like, I mean, I work on a lot of retail systems as well as sort of pharmacy systems and other bits, because, working for a consultancy, you go across lots of different types of industry. And one thing I was building was like a website that sells cars. And we were really focused in on like the server-side rendering aspect for that, because what we're really looking for is really good SEO. We want to have natural search like show up there. So a lot of people are using like frameworks like Next.js, which is possibly the most popular for server-side rendering. You get some on the client, some on the server. But what again we found is that developers found that difficult to deal with, this concept that the same code is going to run in the client and in the browser it's going to run in the browser, but it's also going to run on the server as well. And so you get sort of weird bugs where people just assumed the window object would be present, or they wrote sort of server-side code and it shipped it to the client because they just didn't really understand it. And you could say, okay, well, you just need to be a better developer, or you need sort of better, you need a better senior engineer around you. But there's I guess the counter argument is, should it be that hard to build a web app?
I think in general, it's like, I think one of the things people like about Go is that you can look at the code, and generally speaking, it's relatively easy to read and try to wrap your head around it and understand it. But then there's some languages, TypeScript being one of them at times, where if you aren't intimately familiar with it, looking at it is like, I genuinely have no clue what this is doing, and I've been programming for quite a while. And
Yeah,
like,
I
that's
feel
always
like
weird as a developer, because you're like, there should be, like, I should be able to get a rough idea of what's happening.
Operator in TypeScript every day.
I have not been able to like churn on TypeScript, like enforced like 100% in anything I've ever worked on, because I've just never used TypeScript enough to really learn it that well. Mm-hmm. So there's always cases where I'm just like, I if I had all the time in the world, it'd be great. I'd spend some time. It could be interesting, but because I don't have the time to do that and I don't work on the projects that use it that much, it's like, okay, this is not something for me.
Yeah, I can see that. I think we are at the point now where a lot of developers in the industry have never really seen anything other than React. People with 5 years experience have probably actually never seen a server-side rendered traditional web application. So I think we're at the point now where you actually have to explain, oh yeah, actually it works with a HTTP post, and there's these things called key value pairs that you get in the post, because everybody's so used to pushing JSON around through REST-ish APIs that's just what they're used to doing. So I think, yeah, we're at the point where it's actually, there's a lot more to explain than just, hey, here's a server-side templating kind of thing. And I think even perhaps the name of a templating language doesn't even necessarily resonate. I think if you haven't, if you're from that, if you're old enough like me to remember sort of multiple templating engines over time, then it probably makes sense. Oh, it's another one of those things that I've seen before. But if all you've done is React, then perhaps it's a bit sort of, well, what's a templating library?
Yeah, I started my career in PHP, and I remember like the different. I mean, this was like, in the early 2010s, so it was kind of at the end of all of the new templating engines. But I still remember, like, I started with Drupal, and then we got Twig, and it was this transition and all of this stuff. And it was like, looking at Templ, I was like, this is like a return to like the old days, which is really nice. There was a lot of stuff I appreciated about server-side rendering. And I think in the future too, we're kind of headed to a world where server-side rendering is even more competitive with the kind of front-end only things, especially with like transition API, I think is the big one, because I feel like that's the biggest like negative thing about server-side rendering is, oh, you have this whole big page refresh. You got to do all this state destruction. And it's like, well, we're getting to a place where now you're going to have nice smooth transitions between pages. It's just going to happen all in the browser. And I think go ahead.
It's even more powerful than that these days. If you've looked at HTMX, you're just literally adding a couple of attributes. So you put the HX dash on swap, and you can swap out HX swap attribute, and you can swap out the contents of elements on the screen in relation to events. So like one of the things that I noticed about a lot of the apps I was working on was we were building validation twice, right? Once on the server side because you have to, because you can't trust the input from the client. And then once also on the client side. And sometimes you get like oddities between the two behaviors, or there'll be something that you can only test when you go to the server side. But you can't, so you end up with, it passes in the client, and then there's this kind of extra step where it fails, and it's kind of got this weird UX around it. Whereas I think if you look at something like HTMX, it basically, if you apply these attributes to your HTML and then make sure the JavaScript HTMX client is in there, it'll basically replace all of your full screen postbacks with dynamic replacements, and the feeling of it is surprisingly good. Like, because latency is massively reduced in modern web apps. We have like the ability to use like cloud providers, CDNs, and just Go is really, really fast. So I've got there's an example app on the Templ docs of a counter, and you're clicking the counter, and it's so fast it looks like it's happening locally, but it's actually doing a full post to the server, which is which is actually just a Lambda function. It's doing a database update, a transaction, and then returning the updated count to you, and it just feels like it's happening locally.
We've had the founder, or the guy who created HTMX, on to talk, and I agree, it's a really cool thing to like. I think that's actually part of the reason that Kris asked me to do this, was I think I hosted that one, and like I'm a big fan of seeing these things that allow us to do a lot of the same things we're doing with the really complex front ends, but really simplifying the developer process. And it's cool to see, like, at least ideally in my mind, it's something where hopefully in the future people are learning, okay, I want to see how server side works, then I want to see HTMX, and then like if you really want to get complicated, or you have a need to get really complicated, then you might want to build a complete JavaScript front end of some sort. But in reality, I think the number of applications, at least in the future, I think that will need that is going to be few and far between, or it's got to be a pretty complex app before it starts to, like, things like HTMX start to not work that well.
Yeah, and you don't have to eat it all in one go as well, right? Like, I think one of the things I saw with HTMX that works really well is a kind of micro front end type approach. So like a year or two ago, I was looking at things like module federation in Webpack, and it was really complicated to do. And the basic idea is like breaking up a screen into multiple sections that are owned by different teams. So it's really a kind of way of scaling out your organization rather than kind of for technical reasons so much. But with HTMX, you can point like a div at a remote location. It'll just pull that content in and run it. So it's really straightforward to do that kind of micro front end stuff in a way that is really complicated. It can be really complicated in JavaScript, where you have to sort of all use the same version of React to make it efficient and sort of do all these complicated build steps.
So I want to get back to Templ for a bit, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
So one of the things I was curious about is, if I recall correctly, looking at everything, you can just call you can call Go functions just inside of your templates, correct?
Yeah. There's a few restrictions on it. So initially, the initial design of it, is based around this idea of view models. So like this idea that ideally you'd want your template to be a pure function, right? It wouldn't, like, for instance, call a database inside your template. That would be a bit weird. Like, you would call the database and present the information to the template. But so you can't. So although you can call like any function you want, generally the result has to be a string or something you're going to output to the template, or you can use like standard if and switch statements and so on. But we are going to add arbitrary code in the templates. That's been a feature request from some users. So it wasn't my initial design or the way that I approach building templates, but I don't think it's the job of a templating library to be sort of pedantic about how someone wants to use it. Too opinionated, at least.
So, like, I guess my question is, I need to like dig through the Templ stuff. I unfortunately haven't got to use it too much, so it's limited. But like, how do you go about? I guess you're just using Go please to sort of make sure all that syntax is valid and everything behind the scenes.
Exactly that, yeah. It's that straightforward, yeah. So if you're writing in a Go function inside, say you want a HTML attribute to populate some text on a button, you'd open up a brace and then just use the string. And if the string is in scope, it's fine. If it's not in scope, you'll get a squiggly red underline, like you'd expect. And you can use packages or functions to return those strings just like you would in any other Go code. Because as soon as you open up those braces, what Templ is doing is sort of inside the LSP, it's saying, okay, this section here is Go code, and it knows where that is in the generated Go code, and then it proxies through to Go please in the background. Go please says, hey, this code over here is broken, and then when it returns it to the Templ LSP, it goes, yeah, that code location is actually in the template in this location over here, and so it maps the two things together, which gives you all the power of the LSP for that.
Okay. I'm trying to think of like one of the specific things that I don't like about the HTML template package that Go has is, let's say you wanted a helper to input a CSRF input field. So it needs a CSRF token of some sort. You can't, like, whenever you're compiling your template, you can't not have that function.
Oh, we lost John for a second there.
Oh, we lost.
CSF, we lost you just for a second
sorry.
there. So you're saying when you make a template,
you make a template.
Oh no, technical difficulties. Okay,
he's back.
Am I actually back?
Well,
I think so. Until you start trying to actually talk.
Well, that could be a problem. All right, I'll try one more time. We'll see how this goes. So let's say you're making a template, and in it you need some sort of helper function to take the CSRF token for each specific user and to input it inside of a form. So when you define the template, you can't compile the template or parse it correctly without actually having some sort of function defined, because otherwise the compiler will say, hey, this template you're using a function that's not defined. But at that point, you actually don't have a CSRF function because it's specific to each user.
Oh no!
Can you hear me?
I mean, no, we missed you. You said at the specific point,
no,
you can't have a function because the function's not defined or something. Oh man, I mean.
Am I cutting? I don't know who's cutting is the hard part right now.
I mean, I think the three of us can all see each other still. I think
Yeah.
you're freezing.
Well, every once in a while, Adrian's thing freezes, and I don't think Joe's screen has moved for a while for me, so I'm not really sure.
It's all working for me, I'm afraid.
I could
Yeah.
always like refresh and see if that helps, but I don't know if it will.
The nuclear option.
The
Always.
joys of... Okay, we can just talk about something else.
Oh,
I
yeah.
can add it up
Yeah,
later.
it's like I've got some kind of interference. I do want to talk about CSRF. I'm not sort of doing something to your internet connection. Like, quick, stop him.
It's not even specific about that. I'm more just the default HTML template package. I feel like if you have functions that are specific to each user, and you want to have a helper function inside of your HTML for that, the only real way to make that work.
It's every time you mention CSRF, that's it. There's a big CSRF is.
I'm going to go ahead and refresh and see if that helps with the oversight.
Okay.
I do have a question about the LSP. So when you proxy through, how is it? Is it like rendering it as is it running, so it has something to give to Go Please to actually be like, oh, this is a location, whatnot?
Exactly that. It runs a generation, so it takes in the source template code, runs like generates the Go source code and passes that to Go Please, and then says, hey, here's the latest Go code, and then Go Please responds back with some notifications around, oh yeah, like this is fine, or it returns some diagnostic information to say, hey, this is invalid, or this is a warning, and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So it's running in the background all the time. And obviously the performance of that matters. So I've spent quite a bit of time on things like profiling that and reducing the amount of time. Joe did a lot of optimization work on things like the rendering speed and other bits and pieces of that.
Nice. Okay, John, you are very clear now. Your video is very...
Yeah.
It's hard for me to say what was going on there. But all I was really trying to get at before, I'm almost afraid to talk about it because I want to break the stream. Was there are certain functions that if it's like user specific and you want to have it inside of your template, the only way to really do that with the HTML template package is to like have a fake version of it, and then later when it comes time to actually render it, you have to clone the template and replace that function with another one. And it seemed like Templ does a better job of supporting that type of use case where the function you're calling might be more specific to each individual rendering. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does, and you're absolutely right. Like, one of the things I really wanted to support was component-based design. So, like a lot of the web apps that I build, I tend to use a UI framework of some description that has like pre-built buttons and other bits and pieces. And I wanted to make sure that you could use those kinds of tool sets or design systems inside Templ. So that you could bundle up functionality and sort of share it across different projects. So you can write that in Templ, but you don't have to. You can also, as long as you implement the component interface, any Go code that you write can implement the Templ component interface, and then you can use it inside a template. So if for some reason you want to use something that does dynamic lookups or accesses the request context or does any kind of weird stuff that sort of the Templ syntax is unwieldy for, you can just drop straight into programming language like anything else and use it. The two things are, side by side compatible. Like there's no problem at all to do that. So when you write a template in Templ, it just becomes a function in your Go code, and you can call that function and use it like any other.
Yeah, that was one of the things I thought was like really interesting, especially from like an extensibility perspective, is that it's just this like one interface that's kind of at the center of everything. So it's like, oh, if you want to go like implement some kind of crazy complex thing or some extension, it can still work with the rest of Templ. You don't have to like go and like try to hack this thing in. It's just like, no, it just fits with everything else. It kind of reminds me of web components and like custom elements, where it's like, oh, you can use custom elements built with different libraries together, and they all just function together. It's kind of built on that like kind of core foundational interface.
Yeah, good. Yes, absolutely.
So what kind of projects do you kind of aim Templ to be good for? Is it just kind of like any kind of web app? Is it smaller, medium, larger size? What's kind of your vision for that?
Well, I guess my initial kind of focus was kind of internal admin type systems. So kind of where you've, in my case, we had a Go backends and things like that. We wanted to be able to sort of, what's the minimum amount of work we can do to produce a really effective kind of front end for this stuff, reusing our Go code. So for instance, in one of the projects Joe and I have been working on, we use Go APIs in the back end, but TypeScript in the front end. Okay, so now we've got a problem, right? We've got Go types, and now we have to generate TypeScript types or create TypeScript types. And so we use TypeScriptify for that. Other approaches might mean having some kind of exercise where you use something like Open API specification to do code generation. And now you've got these extra steps in what was previously a fairly straightforward thing. So I was thinking, like, how can we limit the amount of code and stuff we have to do? So initially I was thinking, admin apps and stuff like that. And then also generation of server-side documents and that sort of thing. But I'm thinking actually it's suitable for any kind of web application that you feel like writing. That's the goal, is to make it a genuinely workable alternative to using tools like React. So like, React is a sort of big front end and stuff, and I think Templ is just a way of rendering HTML. You're free to then use HTMX or Turbo/Hotwire or any other kind of front end additions to just raw HTML. You can plug in your favorite CSS library, like one that uses loads of attributes, or like whatever you want to do on top of that. It's up to you.
I like that. I like that vision. Like, take on React.
yeah, that's right. As a really tiny team of like 2 people, but that was part of it actually. Like a lot of the core design was based around this idea of like frustration around the built-in Go templating and like why is there no autocomplete? Like it's been sat in the kind of issues list for ages. And when I looked at kind of how hard it was to implement based on the design of the language, the Go templating language, it doesn't really have any types in it, the built-in one. I was like, oh yeah, well, no wonder it's really difficult. Like it's, it's a real challenge to do that. So I was thinking, yeah, we, it was kind of like, an experiment to see like, would this be possible? Is this real? Like, and also, is it sustainable? Like, can a solo dev essentially manage this? And then Joe's been really active in the project since then. And I think one of the worries, of course, when you adopt something like this is like, is this a sustainable project? Is this just like a flash in the pan? Like, you get bored of it in a year and you'll never see it again. So I wanted to make it like something that I felt like I could manage, that wasn't too crazy, wasn't like out there. So limiting the scope to a reasonable amount, but still making it useful. So yeah, it's a balance to do that. People, like, as the project's gotten more successful, people have a vision for it themselves, or kind of something that they'd like to see, or features they'd like to add. And I think that'll be more challenging to keep control of over time. But it's great to see the numbers of contributors sort of rising, and we're getting really good pull requests now. I think it's probably one of the nice things about making a tool that's aimed at developers is like, hey, they've got a good chance of doing a really good quality pull request.
Yeah, it always feels like one of the tough things about managing an open source project is navigating, like, how do I make sure I stay, involved in this? I still have the energy and the desire to contribute, and how do we manage expanding the community? It's tough. We've had Ben Johnson on the podcast multiple times, and he talks a lot about how challenging it is to kind of maintain projects. And he's kind of gone this route now where he's just like, no, we don't take any outside help, kind of taking the SQLite model of just like, here's the code, you can use it if you'd like, but I'm not going to take any of your requests. But he works on a very different type of thing that I think makes it more challenging for that. Whereas I think you are working on something that is a bit more easy to have more people come into. There's a little, it's not a database at the end of the day, which is quite a bit harder, I would say, than a templating engine. Not that building a templating engine is easy. It's just, databases tend to be really hard.
Yeah, that's totally reasonable. I think one of the things I've been focusing on with interacting with people is trying to explain, it's only sitting down to sort of answer something when I've actually got the time to do a good answer. So trying to resist the urge to dash off a quick reply when you see something, but just take a minute, wait till you've got like a good hour to write a good response and do that. And I guess I've been prioritizing doing a response over writing code as well. And then when I do write code, I try and make a good explanation of, where in the like. So if somebody raises an issue, before I bother to try and fix the issue, I'll probably what I'll sometimes do is explain where the issue is, what the probable causes are, and what the steps might be to fix it. And then I sort of, right, that's it for today. And then I might come back to it a few days later. But sometimes I get back to it and it's sort of, oh yeah, here's the answer then. So it's good.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good way to process things in general, deal with things in general, just to kind of let your subconscious chew on it for a while instead of rushing and trying to figure it out. There's definitely some problems where I've gone down rabbit holes of being like, oh no, I'm figuring this out. And it's just like, no, I just need to sit down and write it out, figure out what it was, and come back to it later. And then it's like, oh, obviously, here is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's probably another good technique for sustainability of open source in general.
Having a good sleep.
Yeah, having good, or just like kind of writing everything down on paper. I've been going through this transformation, going back to being a writer myself, and definitely just like writing things down and spelling it out on the page kind of helps solidify it in a way that's just thinking about it in your head sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all been the consumer of libraries and stuff like that, where you see a bug and it's been fixed, and you're like, oh, fixed in 2.3.1 or something, and you're like, that's great, but I have no idea how to use it, like how to use this kind of new feature or whatever, because there's no docs or there's something, there's nothing else. So earlier this year, I spent, a few days just sitting down to write reasonable docs.
Yeah, I went through all the docs. I was like, these are very good. It's like surprising for like a smaller project having, that plus the LSP. I was like, this is fantastic. Because it's just like the things you don't expect from the newer projects, even though it's not that new, but kind of like these smaller, not like a big company behind it projects.
Yeah,
I think I thought
to explain to people how to use it. I guess one of the enhancements to that in the future is going to be to actually dog food Templ and use it to hopefully generate the docs, because ironically at the moment I think it's using a React-based documentation engine, Docusaurus.
Yeah, it is. Embarrassingly, there was a crash on the page, wasn't there? Which a JavaScript crash on one of the pages, and that was broken for a while. But yeah, I mean, Docusaurus is a great product, right? Like it makes writing documentation pretty straightforward, right? It's just some markdown in a directory, so there's a lot to be grateful for there.
I think there's even times where you're a big software company and you use like WordPress for your blog because it's like no reason to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always the trade-offs on what you want to spend your time focusing on, and it's like you eventually get to bootstrapping. It's like the Go programming language until 1.5 was written in C, so it's like you focus on some things, you eventually get around to making it not like an ironic thing where it's like, no, our documentation site is in fact built with Templ. It's like, does it really matter that much? Probably not.
No, probably not. But in the grand scheme of things, no.
I mean, some people might be like, you should have used Hugo instead of some React thing, but
oh yeah, is it MK Docs? That's the other one.
Yeah.
So when you were writing the docs,
that would be
you're
behind a bit.
You're good, Joe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be a good. We would have something to kind of really try out the web. So we've done a lot of generating documents, and we've kind of tried projects that are actual websites. But if we had like a Docusaurus or Hugo, then we might have some interesting problems, like in that kind of thing, which kind of the rendering, but just kind of showing how that can be done using Templ and HTMX, or I think could be really cool, and just having a playground really features, make sure it works, make sure it's ergonomic.
So for somebody who's like building a new project like this, how did you go about making sure the documentation was actually approachable. I say this because I know when you spent so much time on something, it can sometimes be hard to break it back down to like, how does a beginner actually get into this without assuming certain knowledge?
Well, I started out by writing like a bullet point list of all the things that I thought would need to be covered, and then I looked at other projects that had done a reasonable job of like a walkthrough and compared it to that. And then I asked people. I said, "What do you think about this set of this set of headings? Do you think this is the right set of headings to learn this thing?" And sort of Joe put a lot, Joe fed back on that, and a bunch of other people around, like basically just anyone who would look at it. Hey, in the office, what do you think about this? And then eventually I was like, okay, that seems to be like the way to go about it. And then I just sat down one weekend and just started hacking. Okay, here's the headings, here's the markdown, just get typing, and then lots of editing to make it sort of concise. Cut the nonsense out of it as much as possible. Really tried to make sure that the code samples were straightforward, and put a bit of craft into those sorts of things as well. I mean, you never really know until you get feedback from real users about how successful those things are. But I also wanted to sort of make it super realistic. So there's an example in there of not just how you build templates in an abstract concept, but here's a web application, here's your classic counter, here's your other bits and pieces. And then it also includes the infrastructure to deploy those in both fly.io, which is a really great container way to host little container type apps. And then also running inside Lambda functions as well, which I think is a really good option for sort of low cost hobbyist type projects, and actually commercially as well. So I think for the last 5 years, most of the backends that I've written have been entirely driven by Lambda and DynamoDB for kind of commercial projects, with front ends typically running in sort of Fargate containers running Next.js. So that's been a really successful pattern. So I was like, okay, yep, Lambda. How do you do these things in the infrastructure as well, so you can really get going fast? So yeah, one of the things on our roadmap is the new Go New feature that's sort of being kicked around. This idea that you can create a new Go project. So one of the things I've with Go is you've got this really nice experience, haven't you, of setting up a new project, except you have to start it with Go mod init, which is a sort of really strange set of words. First because as soon as you say to a new Go programmer, hey, first you have to initialize your module with Go mod init. It's okay, what's a module? Why do I have to type this stuff? Whereas I think typing Go New is a much more approachable, oh yeah, I can kind of understand what that's going to do. So yeah, if you imagine saying Go New and it creates you a website structure in Templ, I think that would be a nice way to sort of batteries it's trying to be a bit more batteries included, how to get started. Because I think it's a challenge in the sense of most web projects need both the bit that renders the HTML, the dynamic bit, but also static content like images, JavaScript bundles, CSS bundles, and other bits and pieces. So the hosting isn't always straightforward as well if you want to get the lowest possible cost, which I do.
All right, I think that's a good place to end. So let's move on to our final segment of the show, Unpopular Opinions.
Unpopular opinion. I actually think you should probably leave. Unpopular opinion.
All right. Start with you, Adrian. Do you have an unpopular opinion?
All right, I'm not a fan of Docker.
Mm.
Or Kubernetes. There we go. I said it out loud.
Okay. Do you want to expand upon that at all, or you just want to leave it there?
I think there are lots of different reasons. I guess I think when Docker came out, I was a sort of relatively early adopter using Rancher 1.0 before kind of things like Kubernetes existed, I think, in the wild, and before kind of the cloud providers really got really good options for running stuff. And yeah, it was okay. It was a good way. It's better than doing things like, you know, what I was doing on premises. But I think like over time, I've been a bit more frustrated by some of the limitations of it. So, you know, in terms of like the overall architecture of the thing. So one is like the lack of reproducible builds in Docker containers. Like, you know, essentially you're just running shell commands and, you know, grabbing things off the internet and that sort of stuff. So it's really hard to reproduce a Docker image. They're pretty big. Like, that you still get these kind of multi-hundred megabyte things when, you know, with a Go program, you just got a little binary generally. Running Docker in Docker is still a pain. Like if you want to build a Docker container inside a Docker container or run like that's still a problem. You know, rootless Docker and the security sandboxing around that isn't great. The sandboxing of Docker isn't ideal either. Like it's still difficult to achieve that. So yeah, I think, you know, it seems like we put a lot of effort into Docker, and you know the results are all right, but it's still like I feel like there's more we could do in that space, and perhaps there's some, you know, maybe it's time to more seriously consider more other options. But it's got so much kind of mind share and sort of things going on that, you know, it's the center of a lot of ways of working at the moment.
All right. I think that'd probably be pretty unpopular because people do love themselves some Docker and some Kubernetes. So,
oh yeah, I guess I didn't get into the idea of you know, the problem that Kubernetes solves in sense of like bin packing lots of processes on a single machine isn't necessarily a problem that you face in the modern cloud environment, because you have like a mixture of different instance sizes from providers and so on. And so, you know, are you really benefiting from Kubernetes? I mean, this idea that it's an abstraction layer across your cloud provider is okay, but you generally start using the secrets management features or the kind of database platforms of your underlying platform anyway. So you tend not to be that insulated from it in practice.
yeah. But I definitely don't disagree. I think people kind of use Kubernetes a little too quickly most of the time. It's kind of like, yeah, probably don't have the support you need for this, but. All right. Well, we'll pull that on Twitter and the Fediverse. And,
oh no!
Or I guess X now, X formerly known as Twitter and the Fediverse, and we'll see if our audience agrees.
I'm going to be in trouble, aren't I? Am I going to get cancelled in tech?
We'll see. I am king of unpopular opinions, so or the monarch of unpopular opinions. I got some really good ones. I think I'm still like number 2 of all time. So. You don't have to worry too much, but maybe Joe can one up you. Joe, do you have an unpopular opinion?
I do. Tech related, but my opinion is that socks and sandals are actually underrated combination. I think that for casual footwear, people are looking for like peak breathability. What's more breathable than a sandal?
Doesn't the sock defeat the purpose of that? Like, if you want peak breathability, you would not want to wear socks. Like, why are you wearing socks? And I don't understand it. No, that is unpopular with me. That is.
I'm on board here.
I mean, I would never wear sandals.
A
full brogue.
After all sorts of sporting events, I've taken off shoes and slipped on sandals, and it's so comfortable at that point. And for whatever reason, if you take the socks off, it's just not quite as comfortable.
It just looks weird. It just
sure.
Yeah,
it's coming back.
I'll say this. I don't know that I'd wear it to an interview.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, yes, I can see that. What about Crocs? Crocs sandals? They are, aren't they? And are socks with Crocs an acceptable combination?
I don't think Crocs are ever an acceptable anything. But...
Well, that might be actually an unpopular opinion, because I think that I mean, I'm not an expert on fashion, but I believe them to be quite fashionable at the moment.
I don't know if Crocs were ever fashionable. I think they were just comfortable and people didn't care.
I feel this is kind of like athleisure in general, or like that whole wave, which is kind of like, we all know you don't go to the gym or you're not doing yoga. People are just like, I don't care. I like it's comfortable. I'm gonna wear this. We're wearing sweatpants to the grocery store or whatever. It's like okay, that's what you're gonna. I feel like the people that wear sweatpants to the grocery store are also people that wear socks with sandals or wear Crocs with sandals or wear Crocs with socks.
I wore a tie to work the other day, and just everyone just couldn't understand what was happening. They were just like, "What are you doing? Like, what's going on?" I was just like, I just wanted to make you feel uncomfortable.
That is a thing. I remember it was a few months ago. I saw a tweet, a post on whatever, a tweet of so like this fashion guy, because someone was just like, "Oh, tech people don't care about fashion." He's like, "Yes, you do. Like, try wearing a suit to work and see how people react to you." Like, you just have a very. I feel like you could probably still land a job if you wore socks with sandals to an interview. Like more than if you wore a suit to an interview for like a software eng job.
Yeah, like 10 years ago, my whole team used to wear like shirts and ties to work every single day, right? And I had a client over in San Francisco, and I was over there, and we opened up the video call, and like one of my engineers was stood there, you know, in his shirt and tie, and the whole room started laughing, and I was just like, "Oh, he's an engineer." They were like, "How did you do this?" And I was like, this is just what we were. We're like, it's totally. I think it's totally different now, you know. But yeah, 10 years ago, it's pretty standard for software engineers. Professional job.
Yeah. My first job, I had to wear a business casual, like upper business casual. So it was button-down shirt with a tie and slacks and nice shoes. And
it's definitely who you're interacting with. Like, because I think a lot of government contractors in the States you're still expected to dress reasonably.
Oh no, I feel like John froze again.
Yeah,
it's because he started mentioning government contracts and.
Well, I guess we should try and wrap this up. Socks and sandals. I don't know. We'll pull it on the internet and see how it goes. John, do you want to try
I
with an unpopular opinion?
I'll keep it simple and say that I don't think the HTML template package is that bad. It definitely has quirks and it's weird to get used to, but once you get used to it, it's not terrible. That's not to suggest people shouldn't try Templ. I think they should, but
I think, you know, Templ isn't trying to compete with HTML template. It's going for a React. You know, the HTML template is not the enemy. Not that React is the enemy. It's just a tool, right? Just being a bit of hyperbole for fun.
Although I feel like if you want to use the kind of built-in style, you should go with Google's safe HTML package over HTML templates. I feel like that does some security things that HTML template doesn't do, if I'm remembering correctly.
I think actually Go's HTML templates do a lot of really good stuff around context-aware escaping of stuff. Definitely picked, you know, like it is very much aware of like the context that it's operating in when it's dropping in variables. It's good stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, I stand corrected. All right. Well, I think that that does it for this episode of Go Time. Audience out there, go check out Templ. It's a really cool package, really cool library. Thank you, Adrian and Joe, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us on. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
enjoyed it.
And thank you, John, for co-hosting. And we'll see you in the next one, everybody. Have a good day. Hooray. We made it. Okay, I'm going to stop our recording. So goodbye.